It's week 2 of the Bible Challenge, week that begins 11th of January 2016. And we're talking about lessons that are still in Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. We're in the Psalms, and we're also in the Gospel of Matthew. We start out in Genesis, and if you need a more general background of Genesis, you have to go back and look at week 1 and listen and look at the video for week 1, or look at the written materials online on our website. But here in week 2, we start in chapter 19 in Genesis, and we're going to go all the way through chapter 36 of Genesis. So this is a big chunk of the 50 chapters of Genesis. And what are we talking about? Well, we get the story of Abraham and Sarah, which began back in chapter 11 last week, and it's going to continue from chapters 19 through 25. In chapter 25, we're going to start the story of Isaac and Jacob, and this will continue until the end of the readings this week. When we start next week, then we'll get into the Joseph saga, the story of Joseph and his brothers and how Joseph ends up in Egypt. But we start out today in chapter 19. We ended last week in chapter 18, and this is right on that pivot between the Lord appearing before Abraham under the oaks at Mamre and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The famous dialogue that happens between the Lord and Abraham, where it looks like they're bargaining, and Abraham is saying, if there are 50 in the city who are righteous, will you save the city for the sake of them? We talked about last week in terms of how they're not really bargaining. The Lord is showing how he works to Abraham and saying that for the sake of the righteous, the unrighteous may also be saved. And this is a very new thing in how sin and righteousness are viewed in the ancient world. It's really quite revolutionary. But here we are now, and we're talking about the actual destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the rescue of Lot, who is Abraham's kinsman and also a righteous person. He's listed actually in the text as the only righteous person in Sodom. What happens in the story is Abraham asks the angels, the Lord, to save Lot. Then they do warn Lot to leave the city of Sodom, and Lot leaves with his wife and his daughters. Now remember, in the story, what you're going to encounter is that they're told not to look back. Look forward, keep going, don't look back on what's going to happen to the city. Lot's wife, does look back and is turned into a pillar of salt. Now that's little detail is going to become a little bit important in how Genesis works to try to explain origins. How we talked before about 4 different major authorial strands in Genesis, and one of them is focused very much on how things came to be. Because in the subsequent story of Lot and his daughters, Lot's daughters get their father drunk and commit incest with him. And this is used to say where the Moabites and the Ammonites, who are enemies of Israel, come from. In other words, somebody is sitting there a little bit after the fact and saying, these people who we don't like, this is how they came to be, and it's not a complimentary story about the Moabites and Ammonites, which is why when we think back to our readings last week in the first chapter of Matthew, the genealogy of the human descent of Jesus, it's important that Ruth is included in there, although she's not named. Ruth is included as one of the women by which the line continues, and she's a Moabite. So the Lord is making clear, as we're going to see in the subsequent stories in Genesis as well, that he will use anybody. He will use imperfect people to accomplish his will. And thanks be to God for that, because we all know our own imperfections. So we get the story of Lot and his daughters, the origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites, and we move on to the story of Abraham and Abimelech, starting in chapter 20. This actually should be read in parallel with the story of Abram and his wife Sarah, who is portrayed as his sister when they're in Egypt before Pharaoh. And so Abram has passed Sarah off as his sister to escape trouble. Here there are parallels again with Abraham and Abimelech. They're used to illustrate the justice of God, Abimelech's fear of God, and Abraham's intercessory role. The story continues. This is about origins. This is about how people come to be in different groups. And starting in chapter 21, now we're worried about the heir of Abraham. The Lord has promised him a son. And first we get Abraham having a son by Hagar, his slave woman. This becomes Ishmael. And he's not the heir. He does not become the heir of Abraham. Isaac is born to Sarah, as the Lord had promised a son, and as Sarah had laughed about this, we get Isaac being born, and the name Isaac in Hebrew is kind of a play on words referring to laughter. So think of it in terms of son of laughter. Isaac is born as Abraham's only son, and immediately Abraham is commanded to sacrifice him. In chapter 22, we get the whole story of the sacrifice of Isaac and how Abraham takes his son and they prepare the sacrifice, and Isaac is saying, here's the wood, here's the fire, here's the knife, where's the sacrificial animal? And Abraham says the Lord himself will provide the sacrificial animal. When Abraham does go to kill Isaac, the angel of the Lord stays his hand and says, now we know that you really do fear the Lord. This is kind of the priestly source we talked about, writing, who's very concerned about how the fear of the Lord is. And in the priestly source, fear is about more than just awe of God. It really does look more like actual fear. That is more of an aberration in the Bible, in the sense that the fear of God is not, in most cases, actual fear like somebody we're supposed to be scared of, but more in the sense of somebody who we recognize as being in charge, an object of awe. A partial parallel to this would be if we think of the name Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia, who's remembered as this really bad guy. In Russian, that would be Ivan Grozny. And Grozny is translated literally into English as the terrible, but it's not the best translation. It's more the guy who you don't want to mess with, the big guy who's in charge, the one who is an object of awe. That's the general gist of the fear of the Lord that we're encountering. But in the peace source, we get it more as actual fear. And that seems to be emphasized in the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Mind you, that story is going to point right to the cross, where we find out that the Lord does indeed provide the sacrifice on his own. God has promised the birth of a son, and of course we get Ishmael through Hagar, Isaac through Sarah. This is the origin of the differences between those who consider themselves Jews and those who consider themselves Palestinians. And the fact that it goes back to early stories talking about different origins is still an issue in our day and age. As we're going to find later, the differences between Esau and his brother are used to describe the differences between Jews and non-Jews in the Middle East. And there's rivalry going all the way back to the beginning. Sibling rivalry, as we know, is intense. Abraham's faith is tested in his command to sacrifice his son. And then we get the saga of Jacob and Esau. Jacob being the son and Esau being the other son. Jacob is an alternate name for Isaac. We've got more than one source here. We get these origins of different peoples and origins of enmities. And again, we see that the patriarchs are depicted as wily, slippery kinds of people who you might not want to buy a used car from. The point being that God's will be affected regardless of the human agents he chooses. His own purposes will control. The biblical theology is basically that God acts in history. He uses real flesh and blood to accomplish his purposes. God directs all human history, and Jacob is blessed with and begets the 12 sons who become the tribes of Israel. In other words, the blessing promised to Abraham back in chapter 12 is continued. That's where we're going to get in Genesis this week. In the Psalms, we're still in the early part of the Psalter, Psalms 7 through 12. And here's where we pick up different forms. We talked about different forms of Psalms. We start out in Psalm 7 with an individual lament, one who's innocent and has been unjustly accused and is asking God to vindicate him. This actually is appointed in the Western monastic rite for use in the office of the dead, so it's used at burials. The idea here is that the people of God may pray with confidence that God will vindicate them. Interesting that that's used in the office of the dead, because vindication at that point is before one's judge, and that's God. So God will vindicate us before God. And we know that in Jesus Christ we have our one mediator and intercessor who is also our judge. So the psalm and the use of the psalm play off of that rather well. In Psalm 8 we get a hymn of praise to the Creator. There are echoes back to what happens in Genesis 1 in the plan of creation. God's greatness is revealed, and that he enables mere mortals, us, to participate in carrying out his plan of creation. Psalms 9 and 10 really need to be read together. God demonstrates his righteousness in judging the wicked and in preserving the weak. These are kind of contrasting halves of how God works. In Psalm 12 we get a song of trust. It's used in the church at Ascension Day. So on Ascension Day we celebrate the inauguration of Jesus' reign in heaven, and we say we can trust in our King. Finally, in Psalm 12 we get a community lament. We're all beating our breasts together here, and the basic message here is that God's words are the only true words, and that in a world of tyranny and deception we have to rely on God's promises. In the Gospel readings, we're slap dab in the middle of Matthew, and we start out at the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we got the meat of the Sermon on the Mount with Jesus giving us the Beatitudes, talking about salt and light, talking about himself as the fulfillment of the law. Here in chapters 7 through 12, we're encountering first the conclusion of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is instructing us about judging and about constancy in prayer. Now, one of the lines that most people who know no other part of the Bible will quote to us is, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." And it's pretty obvious if they quote that relating to just somebody having a problem with what they're doing, that they haven't read their Bible. First of all, we have to remember that when Jesus uses the term "you" in one of our English translations, we have to determine whether the term is singular or plural. In the Greek that is used to write Matthew's Gospel, and in the underlying Hebrew or Aramaic that would have been spoken or written, you singular and you plural are two different words. Being from the South, I can say that we still have two words in English. One is you and one is y'all. When I was in high school, I lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it would be you or yous guys, but you get the idea. When Jesus says that we are not to judge, first of all, he's not talking about conduct. He's talking about whether or not we can tell whether somebody else will ultimately be in right relationship with God. This is judgment with a capital J. When he tells us not to judge, he also uses the singular you. In other words, no one of us can determine whether or not somebody is in right relationship with God. He does tell us, however, that we can judge conduct, and that's where he uses the plural. And he uses the plural in the sense of addressing the church. For example, in chapter 16, which we don't get to this week, when Jesus talks about the foundation of the church, he says, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So the idea that we can't judge really is restricted to whether we can say somebody is saved or damned, if we want to make a shorthand out of that. But we can and do judge all the time, whether something's good or bad, whether it's acceptable behavior or unacceptable behavior, whether it's a healthy decision or an unhealthy decision. However we want to look at that, the world judges all the time, and Jesus in Matthew does not tell us that we cannot do that. Pronouns are important. Well, those are a little confused in English sometimes. Jesus is focused on judgment here in the sense of whether or not a person is ultimately going to see God or be excluded from God's kingdom. The sermon goes on, though, to speak about the costs of discipleship. In other words, this isn't just, a candy store where we get everything delivered to us by God. We have to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus Christ. Now, here's where popular language also isn't helpful. A common expression, at least used to be, well, we all have our cross to bear. When we talk about somebody who had a burden in life, somebody who had a spouse with a substance abuse problem, or a wayward child, or something like that, we'd roll our eyes and cluck cluck and say, well, we all have our cross to bear. That's not what Jesus is talking about. That's a burden. And Jesus says that we're to bring our burdens to him and that he will help us bear our burdens. A cross is something we take up voluntarily. That involves the voluntary denial of self. A cross could be that I'm going to do the Bible challenge to get to know God better. A cross could be something as simple as daily prayer. A cross could be denial of self in the sense of fasting. A cross could be things little or big, but it is something that is engaged in voluntarily. The point Jesus is making is that there is a cost of discipleship, and that when he calls us to follow him, we have to remember where he goes, which is first to the cross. He goes on, though. Discipleship has to bear fruit. It's not just about denial, but when we deny ourselves, we will bear the fruits of God's will. Not everybody who confesses Jesus will bear that fruit. He makes that pretty explicit in chapter 7, verses 21 to 23. Not everybody who calls me Lord is going to be known by me ultimately. We have to both confess Jesus as Lord and act like he's Lord. In other words, it's easy to say, I want a Savior, Save Me app on my phone when I'm in trouble. Saying Jesus is Lord means we actually have to deny what we might otherwise want to do. Chapters 8 and 9 in Matthew, we get teachings on authority and invitation. Jesus exercises authority in all the healings he engages in, and his authority is recognized by another. In this case, a centurion who has a sick slave, who comes and asks Jesus to heal his slave, and Jesus says he will. And the centurion says, you don't have to come with me, just say it will be done. I'm a man under authority, I know how it works in the army. You say it's going to be done, it's going to be done. This is the person of whom Jesus says he hasn't seen such faith in Israel. Now, what's a centurion doing here, and what's going on? Jerusalem, Judea, all of this area is part of the Roman province of Judea. And in Judea, there is a Roman legion, a legion of the Roman army. It's actually the 10th Fretensis legion during the time when Jesus is walking around as a grown man. That would translate as the 10th Legion of the Strait. And it's a reference to the legion being raised during the Roman Civil War and being based near the Strait of Messina between Sicily and Italy. Now they're based in Palestine. The legion has about 5,200 legionnaires, that means Roman citizens. and about another 5,200 auxiliaries. That means not Roman citizens. Auxiliaries can earn Roman citizenship by serving out their whole term. The auxiliaries tend to be service troops or cavalry. The cavalry, in the case of the 10th Fretensis Legion, is mainly from North Africa. The legionnaires themselves are organized into what are called cohorts and then centuries. So a century is kind of like a senior NCO, maybe a warrant officer or a junior officer in a modern army. If you think about the way a modern army works, senior NCOs, warrant officers, junior officers know each other. There are only 52, in some legions 59 centuries, and with a group of about 50 to 60 centurions, which would include those at headquarters, they all know each other. So keep this centurion in mind, because we're going to encounter two more centurions in our readings. One is the centurion whom Peter's going to encounter in Acts, who is the first Gentile to be baptized. That's in the 10th chapter of Acts. And one is the centurion at the cross, who in church tradition is named Longinus and eventually becomes a bishop. These folks talk to each other. They know each other. And so the centurion who's had his slave healed may well have talked to the centurion who ends up at the cross, who is the first one to confess who Jesus is and says, truly, this was the Son of God. And the centurion who Peter then meets and is the first Gentile who's baptized in the 10th chapter of Acts. Word gets around an army. Word gets around the NCO Corps in an army. They're talking to each other. Seeds are being sown while Jesus is walking around. The centurion is probably what is called a God-fearer, because the members of the synagogue say he's worthy, he paid for our synagogue. God-fearers are non-Jews in Palestine and other parts of the empire who recognize that the Jews worship the true God. But since they're not Jews, they can't participate in temple worship. They tend to participate in what happens in synagogues and pray to God as their God as well. So the centurion here is probably a God-fearer, puts him in an interesting position of conflict in terms of the imperial cult. Jesus goes on in our readings and teaches about mission. The mission and commissioning of disciples is described. Jesus describes what discipleship looks like. It doesn't look like satisfying ourselves. Pay attention in chapter 10 there. Because that sets us up for chapters 11 and 12, where Jesus is rejected by his own generation. We'd like it to look like what we want. When it doesn't, it's easy to say no, and so the chapters follow one after another in a logical sequence, bearing in mind, of course, that when Matthew wrote this, there were not chapters and verses. It was a continual narrative. Now, what do we get in terms of notable stories in our readings in Matthew this week? Well, we get Jesus stilling the storm on the Sea of Galilee, exercising power as God. We get the call of Matthew, the tax collector. We get many notable healings. We get the responses given in chapter 11 when John the Baptist, who's in prison, sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one we've been waiting for, or should we wait for somebody else? And the way Jesus responds is to say, tell John that the blind receive their sight, that the deaf receive their hearing, that the tongues of the dumb are released, and that those who are lame leap like a deer. Words to that effect. He's referring right back to chapter 35 in Isaiah's prophecies, where Isaiah says what happens when the Messiah shows up. So Jesus is giving an answer back to John saying, yes, I am the Messiah, and the disciples would John's disciples would understand that answer as well. The other thing Jesus does in our readings this week is exercise authority over the law. This is when they're plucking the grains of wheat and eating on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees get upset. They get upset when Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath And Jesus makes the point that the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. In doing that, he's showing that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is God. That's where we're going to get this week. Next week we'll continue with the rest of Genesis and start Exodus. We'll continue in the Psalms and we'll continue in Matthew.